The foundation is unstable. Construction should not proceed. Filed by Engineer 1, March 14th. The foundation is unstable. Construction should not proceed. Filed by Engineer 2, April 3rd. The foundation is unstable. Construction should not proceed. Filed by Engineer 3, April 29th. The bridge opened to traffic on September 12th. It collapsed on November 7th. Nobody was surprised, except the people on it. Let me tell you about a particular kind of catastrophe. Not the kind caused by ignorance, not the kind caused by bad luck or bad weather, or materials that failed in ways nobody predicted. The kind where people knew, where they wrote it down, where they signed their names to documents that said, clearly, in plain language, "This will fail." And then it failed anyway. This kind of catastrophe has a name. Engineers call it an organizational accident. What that means, stripped of the jargon, is this: nobody made one big, terrible decision. Instead, a series of small, reasonable-looking decisions accumulated, each one defensible on its own, each one passing through the proper channels until the outcome became inevitable. The bridge we are talking about today was built in the early 20th century. I am going to call it Blackwell Bridge, after the researcher who documented it most thoroughly, because the actual name, the actual location, is less important than the pattern. And the pattern is what we are here for. Blackwell Bridge was a medium-span railway bridge. Not enormous, not technically exotic. It was the kind of project that a competent regional engineering firm could execute in a year and a half, using methods that were well understood at the time. The engineering firm was competent, the methods were well understood, and the bridge still fell. Here is why. Before you build a bridge, you study the ground. This is not optional. It is not a formality. The ground is the whole problem. Everything above it, every cable and bolt and beam, is ultimately in conversation with the earth beneath the foundations. If that conversation goes wrong, nothing else matters. The ground beneath Blackwell Bridge was clay, specifically a type of clay with a known and well-documented tendency to shift under sustained load. Civil engineers in that region knew about this clay. They had a name for it. They had protocols for working with it. Those protocols existed precisely because bridges had sunk into that clay before. The protocols said, when building on this substrate, drive piles to the load-bearing stratum below. Don't anchor in the clay. Don't assume the clay will hold. It won't. The contractor, looking at the timeline and the budget, proposed a different approach. Instead of driving piles to the deep stratum, which would have added 6 weeks and a significant cost, they would use spread footings. Wider, shallower foundations sitting on the clay itself. The contractor's proposal went to the project engineer. The project engineer, whose name was Harris, reviewed it, and Harris filed the first report. The report was 3 pages. It was precise. It cited the soil survey. It cited 2 previous bridge failures in the same region, on the same substrate, using the same foundation method. It concluded, the proposed foundation design presents an unacceptable risk of differential settlement under operational load. Construction should not proceed as specified. Harris sent the report up the chain, to his section chief, to the project manager, to the client's representative. Then he waited. What happened to Harris is the first mechanism in our cause chain, and it is important to understand it clearly because it was not dramatic. There was no confrontation. Nobody told Harris he was wrong. Nobody produced counter-evidence. Nobody commissioned a second soil study to challenge his findings. What happened was much simpler and much more corrosive. Harris was reassigned. His supervisor called him in, explained that there was a more pressing project, a viaduct 200 kilometers away that needed an experienced site engineer immediately. It was a compliment, really. Harris was the right man for it. His work on Blackwell was mostly done at this stage anyway. The soil survey was complete, the initial design review was finished. What remained was construction oversight. And that could be handled by a junior engineer. Harris asked about his report. His supervisor said the report was on file. It would be reviewed. These things took time. Harris took the reassignment. This is the first decision in the chain. Not malicious, not even consciously dishonest. A supervisor needed to move an engineer, and moving Harris also had the convenient side effect of removing the person who had formally objected to the project. Nobody said that out loud. It didn't need to be said out loud. The report sat in a filing cabinet. Construction began. The junior engineer assigned to replace Harris on site was a man named Kowalski. He was 26 years old. He had 3 years of field experience. He was not, by any account, a bad engineer. Kowalski arrived on site in late March. Within 2 weeks, he had read the soil survey, reviewed Harris's report, and conducted his own visual inspection of the foundation work in progress. He filed the second report. It was shorter than Harris's, 1 page, because Kowalski was 26 and didn't yet know how to make a bureaucratic case. But it said the same thing. The spread footing design is being implemented on soil that will not support sustained load. The risk of settlement and structural failure is significant. What happened to Kowalski was slightly different from what happened to Harris. He wasn't reassigned. He was called in by the project manager, a man named Aldridge, and given what Kowalski later described as a thorough education in the realities of project management. Aldridge explained, the foundation design had been approved. The contractor had agreed to a delivery schedule. The client had announced a completion date. Costs were committed. There was a process for raising technical concerns, and that process had been followed, and the concern had been considered, and the decision had been made to proceed. Kowalski was told that his job was construction oversight, not design review, not foundation engineering. His job was to ensure the contractor was building what had been specified. Kowalski filed a third report, a follow-up clarifying that he stood by his assessment, and then, feeling that he had done what he could, continued doing his job. 3 weeks later, he was transferred to a different project. Let me pause here and explain what we are watching, because it would be easy to look at this story so far and conclude that Aldridge was the villain. Someone made a bad decision and then covered it up, and that is the story. But that is not what this is. Aldridge was not, by the record, a dishonest man. He was a project manager under genuine pressure. He had a client who needed a bridge. He had a contractor who had committed to a price. He had a schedule, and he had 2 junior engineers back-to-back filing reports that said the approved design was wrong. Here is the thing about being in Aldridge's position. If you take the report seriously, you blow up the project. You go back to the client and say the foundation is wrong. The client asks why this wasn't caught earlier. The contractor submits a change order. The schedule slips by 2 months. Someone asks why you approved the original design. Questions get asked that nobody wants to answer. Switching to pile foundations at the point when Harris filed his report, before construction began, would have cost roughly 18% more and added 6 weeks to the schedule. Painful, explainable, survivable. Switching after Kowalski filed his report, construction already underway, would have required tearing out completed work. The cost estimate prepared at the time, which survives in the project file, was 41% over budget. The schedule hit 14 weeks. The contractor had penalty clauses that kicked in at 12 weeks. The client had a railway operations plan built around the original opening date. The knock-on costs would have exceeded the original construction budget. Aldridge was not looking at a choice between spend a little more and be safe versus save money and gamble. He was looking at a choice between deliver the project and probably be fine versus blow up the budget, blow up the schedule, reopen questions about your own sign-offs, and still not be certain the thing won't fall down anyway. Because here is the thing that is easy to forget from our position. Aldridge did not know the bridge would fall. He knew there was a risk. He assessed the risk as manageable. He was wrong. But from inside his situation, with the information he was choosing to wait, the decision to proceed was not irrational. This is the mechanism. It is not corruption. It is not malice. It is the rational behavior of a person trapped inside a system where raising an alarm costs everything immediately and ignoring an alarm costs nothing, right up until the moment it costs everything all at once. The asymmetry is the whole problem. The cost of acting on the reports was concrete, immediate, and fell entirely on Aldridge. The cost of ignoring them was probabilistic, deferred, and, if the bridge stood, which most bridges did, might never materialize at all. Every incentive in the system pointed the same direction, and Aldridge followed the incentives. He made the rational choice. It just happened to be the wrong one. The third engineer was a man named Voss. He was senior, more senior than Harris, more senior than Kowalski, and he arrived on site not because he was assigned there, but because he was conducting a routine quality inspection of several projects in the region. Voss spent 2 days at Blackwell. He reviewed the file, including Harris's report and Kowalski's report. He examined the completed foundation work. He commissioned a small test, a load probe on one of the footings. The footing moved, not catastrophically, not visibly, but under the probe load. The instruments showed a deflection that should not have been there if the foundation was solid. Voss filed the third report. It was longer than either of the first two. It included the load probe data. It included photographs. It included a calculation showing the expected settlement under operational train loads and the range of possible outcomes, including the worst case. The worst case was collapse. Voss sent his report directly to the regional director of engineering, bypassing the project manager entirely. The regional director's office acknowledged receipt. Then, 2 weeks later, Voss received a formal response. The response noted that the foundation design had been reviewed and approved according to established protocols. It noted that construction was now 80% complete. It noted that the cost of remediation at this stage would be substantial. It recommended that monitoring instruments be installed on the completed bridge and that load limits be posted pending further assessment. Monitoring instruments. Load limits pending further assessment. Voss wrote back. He said that monitoring instruments would record the failure, not prevent it. He said that posted load limits would not be followed if nobody understood why they existed. He said that the bridge should not open. He received no further response. Construction was completed. The bridge opened to traffic on September 12th. Voss was not invited to the opening ceremony, which was probably fine with him. The bridge stood for 57 days. During that time, trains crossed it regularly. The scheduled load limits were, as Voss had predicted, inconsistently observed, not out of defiance, but because the load limit signs were posted without explanation, and the local dispatcher saw no reason to enforce them strictly when the bridge appeared sound. His name in the documentation is rendered only as the operating dispatcher at the junction. He had worked that junction for 11 years. He knew the bridge. He had watched it be built. He had been present at the opening ceremony in September. Nobody had told him why the load limit signs were there. There was no instruction in his operations manual about the Blackwell Bridge signs specifically. They were routine. They were routinely not enforced to the letter during normal operations. The dispatcher was not negligent. He was operating exactly as the system expected him to operate. The information that would have changed his behavior was not in his operations manual. It was in a filing cabinet in the regional director's office. Meanwhile, under the bridge, the clay was doing what clay does under sustained load. It was compressing. Not uniformly, that is the problem with spread footings on variable soil. The southern footing was on slightly wetter ground than the northern footing. Wet clay compresses faster. The two footings were settling at different rates. The bridge deck was being very slowly, very incrementally, racked. Bolted connections were taking stresses they weren't designed for. The deck camber was going the wrong way. If you had put a surveyor's level on the bridge deck in week 6 and compared it to the opening day measurement, you would have seen a drop at midspan of approximately 40 millimeters. 40 millimeters over 6 weeks. Small enough that nobody standing on the deck would notice. Large enough, in a structure designed to tolerances of 8 to 10 millimeters, to mean that the bridge was already structurally compromised before November arrived. The monitoring instruments recommended by the regional director's office had not yet been procured, because procurement took time, and in the meantime the bridge was operating. On November 7th, a freight train of moderate tonnage, well within the nominal design capacity of the bridge, crossed at standard speed. The southern approach span failed first. A bearing shifted off its seat, the deck dropped, the train derailed, and the sudden redistribution of load finished what the clay had started. The main span came down in 11 seconds. The train crew survived. The span fell into a shallow river at low water. Nobody died. This is, in retrospect, almost statistically improbable, but nobody died. The bridge was completely destroyed. Within 2 weeks, a formal engineering commission was convened to determine the cause of the collapse. 5 members, none of them had been involved in the project. Competent and independent. They spent 4 months investigating. They reviewed the soil surveys. They interviewed the contractor. They interviewed Aldridge. They interviewed Voss. They retrieved Harris's report and Kowalski's report from the filing cabinet, where they had been sitting for 8 months. Voss arrived prepared. He brought his own copies of his report, his load probe data, and the letter from the regional director's office that had thanked him for his concern and suggested monitoring instruments. The commission chair read the letter slowly. Then he set it down. Then he asked Voss, "When you wrote that monitoring instruments would record the failure rather than prevent it, did you believe the bridge would fail?" Voss said yes. The chair asked, "Did you believe it would fail soon?" Voss said he didn't know how soon. The rate of settlement depended on load frequency and soil moisture. His estimate had been 1 to 3 years under operational conditions. It had taken 57 days. The chair thanked him, made a note, moved to the next question. What the commission did not ask, what nobody asked, formally, at any stage of the proceedings, was why Voss's report had been filed and then ignored. The commission's mandate was to determine the cause of the collapse and recommend remediation. It was not to determine accountability. There was no mechanism for that. The decision chain was too long, too diffuse, too full of individually defensible choices for any single person to be held responsible for the outcome. Aldridge was interviewed. He answered the commission's questions fully and accurately. He was not disciplined. He continued working. He managed 2 further projects in the following decade, both of which were delivered on time. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had made a calculation that turned out to be wrong. The system had no way to distinguish between those 2 things, and so it treated them as the same. The commission's primary finding was this: the foundation design was unsuitable for the soil conditions. Spread footings should not have been used. Pile foundations driven to the load-bearing stratum below the clay would have been required for safe long-term performance. Their secondary finding was that 3 separate engineers had identified this problem before construction was complete, had filed formal reports, and had been removed from the project or had their concerns dismissed without substantive technical rebuttal. Their recommendations, better soil investigation protocols, clearer escalation pathways for safety concerns, protections for engineers who file dissenting reports. The Commission recommended exactly what the three engineers had recommended. The Commission was taken seriously. The engineers were not. One sentence. That is the whole story. This is the question worth sitting with. Harris, Kowalski and Voss were qualified. Their reports were technically correct. Their warnings were specific, documented and filed through proper channels. They did everything right. The Commission was 5 people who arrived after the bridge was already rubble. They had less information than the original engineers, less site access, less real-time data, less ability to run tests on the actual materials. But the Commission was taken seriously. The engineers were not. Why? The Commission had no stake in the outcome. The engineers did, or rather, the people above them did. Harris's supervisor had a schedule to protect. Aldridge had a budget. The regional director had already approved the design. Every person in the chain who dismissed the reports had something to lose if the reports were right. The Commission had nothing to lose. The bridge was already gone. Nobody's career depended on the rubble being rubble for the right reasons. This is the fundamental structural problem. The people who are best positioned to catch a disaster in progress are embedded in exactly the organizational structure that has the most incentive to ignore them. And the people who are called in after the fact, who have no skin in the game, who can look at the evidence without filtering it through career anxiety, they arrive when the only thing left to do is count the damage. Here is the thing about Blackwell Bridge. It is not exceptional. That is the point. Blackwell documented it because it was a clean example. The paper trail was intact. The sequence of events was traceable. The gap between what engineers said and what the institution did was clear enough to put in a textbook. But the pattern is not exceptional. It shows up in aviation. It shows up in nuclear power. It shows up in pharmaceutical approval. It shows up in construction, in mining, in chemical manufacturing. It shows up anywhere that organizations have to make decisions under time and budget pressure about risks that won't materialize immediately. 3 examples, fast ones. Because the point is not the details, the point is the repetition. Aviation. The engineers at the company that manufactured a specific turbine blade had documented a fatigue crack propagation pattern at a particular stress frequency. The documentation was internal. The maintenance interval recommended by the engineers was more frequent than the interval approved for commercial operations, because more frequent maintenance meant more downtime, and more downtime meant the airline clients would go to competitors. The engineers' recommendation sat in a file. Blades failed. People died. The commission that investigated recommended the maintenance interval the engineers had recommended. The engineers were not called to testify because the company's legal team had advised that calling them would raise questions about what the company had known and when. Chemical manufacturing, 1984. The safety officer at a large industrial facility in central India had filed 4 separate reports over 18 months documenting inadequate pressure relief systems on the methyl isocyanate storage tanks. Each report was acknowledged. Each report was classified as under review pending capital allocation. Capital was not allocated. On the night of December 2nd, a runaway exothermic reaction in one of those tanks killed between 3,000 and 8,000 people. The estimate varies depending on methodology. In what remains the deadliest industrial accident in history, the safety officer survived. His reports survived. They were read into the record at subsequent legal proceedings. The company settled civil claims for a sum that worked out to roughly $500 per fatality. Space, 1986. Engineers at the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle had been raising concerns about the O-ring seals in cold weather since 1977. By 1985, those concerns were specific, documented, and urgent. The night before the Challenger launch, in a phone conference between the engineers and NASA management, the engineers recommended delaying the launch due to the overnight temperature forecast. Management asked the engineers to reconsider. One manager told his engineering team to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. The engineers, under that pressure, changed their recommendation. The launch proceeded. 73 seconds after liftoff, the O-ring failed exactly as the engineers had predicted it would. The presidential commission that investigated the Challenger disaster included physicist Richard Feynman, who demonstrated the O-ring failure mechanism by dipping a piece of the material in a glass of ice water at the televised hearing. It took him 45 seconds. The engineers had been saying the same thing for 9 years. The pattern has a structure. Someone close to the problem sees the problem. They report it. The report enters a system that has more incentive to continue than to stop. The report is not refuted. Refuting it would require engaging with it seriously, which might force a decision. The report is reclassified. The person who filed it is moved or pressured. Operations continue. A second person sees the same problem, same sequence. A third, same. At some point, the timeline of decisions that were each individually defensible has produced an outcome that nobody individually decided to cause. This is what organizational accident means. Not that the organization was reckless, not that individuals were malicious, but that the structure of the organization, the incentives, the reporting lines, the career consequences of speaking up, systematically filtered out the correct information and proceeded on the incorrect information instead. Let me tell you what happened to the 3 engineers. Harris spent the rest of his career working on smaller projects. He never worked on a major bridge again, not because he was formally sanctioned, but because the informal network of project assignments simply never put him in that position. He retired in 1941. He gave one interview in his retirement in which he said he had thought about Blackwell Bridge every year since the collapse. Kowalski left engineering entirely. He went into teaching. He taught structural mechanics at a technical college for 30 years. Former students described him as someone who was very interested in what could go wrong. Voss continued working, was eventually promoted to a senior inspection role, and spent the second half of his career developing the very monitoring and escalation protocols that the Commission had recommended. He died in 1953. His obituary mentioned his distinguished career in infrastructure safety and did not mention Blackwell Bridge. There is a term for what we have been describing. Researchers in organizational safety call it the consequence gap, the gap between the moment when the risk is visible and the moment when the risk materializes. In Blackwell's case, the gap was 8 months. During those 8 months, everyone in the system was operating on the assumption that the gap would be infinite, that the risk would never materialize, because most of the time it doesn't. Most bridges stand. Most planes land. Most chemical plants don't explode. The base rate of catastrophe is low enough that the rational prior, in any given instance, is probably fine. The problem is that institutions don't fail at random. They fail at the exact place where the consequence gap has been widest for the longest time, because that is where the most deferred risk has accumulated. The clay under Blackwell Bridge had been compressing for 8 months. By the time it gave way, the load path had degraded so far that the failure, when it came, was total. And here is why this matters beyond engineering, beyond bridges, beyond planes, beyond chemical plants. The same failure mode operates in any institution that makes decisions under uncertainty with asymmetric consequences. Financial institutions, where the people structuring the instruments are not the people who will bear the loss when they fail. Pharmaceutical companies, where the people running the trial are not the patients who will take the drug. Technology companies, where the people deploying the system are not the communities that will live with its effects. In every case, The person who sees the problem is embedded in the system and has everything to lose by saying so loudly. Their career, their relationships, their daily working life, all of it is contingent on the system continuing to function. The system continuing to function requires the uncomfortable information to be managed, classified, deferred. And the person who investigates after the fact has nothing to lose. They arrive after the bridge is rubble. They have no stake in whether the rubble fell for the right reasons. They can be honest because honesty costs them nothing. We have built societies that are very good at investigating what went wrong. We are much worse at listening to the people who told us it would go wrong before it did. After the Commission published its report, the Regional Engineering Authority implemented new protocols, escalation pathways, descent registers, independent technical review requirements for foundations on problem soils. The protocols were used twice in the following decade. Both times, they flagged genuine problems. Both times, the problems were addressed before construction reached an irreversible stage. The protocols worked. They worked because 3 engineers named Harris, Kowalski and Voss were correct about a bridge in the early 20th century, and their correctness was documented carefully enough that it survived into the institutional memory of the authority long enough to become policy. They were not thanked for this. There is no plaque. Their names do not appear in the official history of the authority. The Commission was commended. The Commission's recommendations were implemented. The Commission's chair received an award. The engineers filed reports. The reports were correct. The reports were ignored. The bridge fell. The Commission arrived. The Commission said what the engineers said. The Commission was listened to. This is not an anomaly. This is how it works. So here is what to leave with. The next time you hear about a catastrophe, a building that fell, a product that failed, an institution that collapsed, and you hear that it was unforeseeable, do one thing. Ask who filed the report. Because there is almost always a report. There is almost always a Harris. There is almost always someone who wrote 3 pages and signed their name to it and sent it up the chain and then waited. And there is almost always a filing cabinet. And the report is usually right. Not sometimes, not often, usually. The people closest to the problem, the people with their instruments on the actual ground, with their eyes on the actual seams and joints and stress lines, they are, as a class, more right than the people who manage them. They have less to protect. Their job is to understand the thing, not to deliver the thing on schedule. The bridge didn't fall because nobody knew. It fell because knowing and deciding are not the same thing. And the people responsible for deciding had very good reasons, from inside their own situation, to decide the way they did. That is not a comforting thought, but it is an honest one. And honesty, as Harris would tell you, doesn't always go where you file it. The question is not whether the next Harris exists. He does. Right now, somewhere, there is a person who has written a report and is waiting. The question is whether the institution he works inside has been designed to hear him. Most haven't been. Yet. Next video, children sent into chimneys. Because the tools to do it safely cost more than the children did. Same logic, different century.